Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Goveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
Way smaller or non-existent, or maybe in some cases even go the other direction than the differences in income. I'll tell you, for example, an interesting story which happened to me. I remember that maybe 15 years ago, and of course we may have many anecdotes like that, but this one really stuck in my mind. It was in Germany, I think in Dortmund or somewhere, and the guy picked me up at the airport, and he was a taxi driver. He drove me, and we talked during the ride. He was an Afghani. He was an Afghani engineer, so who actually left Afghanistan, the war was raging in the country, and then came to Germany. And then finally we stopped. We talked quite a lot of things, and, we stopped in front of the hotel, and he turns back and says, "And now tell me, why am I driving you and you're not driving me?"
welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 368 with Branko Milanovic. Branko is a presidential professor at the Graduate Center and a senior fellow at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. He obtained his PhD in economics from the University of Belgrade with a dissertation on income inequality in Yugoslavia. He served as lead economist in the World Bank Research Department for almost 20 years and as a senior associate at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington from 2003 to 2005. He has held teaching appointments at the University of Maryland and at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of Capitalism Alone, the future of the system that rules the world. In it, he argues that capitalism has triumphed because it works. It delivers prosperity and gratifies human desires for autonomy. But it comes with a moral price, pushing us to treat material success as the ultimate goal. In what is becoming an increasingly polarized world, I really enjoyed getting somewhat out of my comfort zone to talk economics with Branko. We went an inch deep and a mile wide in this conversation and covered numerous topics, including 1. The merits of capitalism, its criticisms and what could be improved. 2. Equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. 3. Whether inequality is an avoidable feature of nature. 4. Job automation and universal basic income. And 5. Inequality in sports, namely professional soccer, or football as I like to call it. With that, I bring you my conversation with the one and only Branko Milanovic. Welcome to the show, Branko.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be your guest and to be able to speak with you.
No, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. I understand you're joining me all the way from Spain at the moment.
That's true. I'm actually right now in Barcelona.
Yes, and you're about to understand the Champions League is playing in the background, and I know you're a big football fan, so I'm going to ask you some important questions today, but the big question that I need to ask you is Red Star or Partizan?
Well, Red Star lost 6-0 against Bayern yesterday, so I should never say that I'm their fan.
Okay, fair enough. I think I have a soft spot for Red Star. Being of Macedonian background, I think when we had Darko Pančev playing for Red Star back in 1991, all of the Macedonians supported Red Star, and I think we've stayed that way ever since.
Yeah, actually, just read today that, they were actually mentioning Pančev because he was, of course, part of that team that won the Champions League, and they were saying basically the Red Star has not had a forward, a real forward player, like a center forward for like 30 years. So That's what I just read today.
Well, there you go. I'll have to dig that article up after the conversation. But of course, we can talk about football all day, but we're here to talk about capitalism, economics, inequality, all sorts of good stuff. So I know you've got a new book out, and we can touch on that during the conversation. But kicking off, I mean, for the first time in human history, Branko, the globe is essentially dominated by one economic system. And over the last 120 years, I mean, it's gone on to transform our lives. We have running water, healthcare, education, sanitation. Like, life is very good. We even have Uber Eats. So if we want to get some Indian curry delivered to our door, we can do that with the click of a button. Given that things are so good, why is capitalism on the receiving end of so much criticism?
Yes, actually, it is, of course, a good question. You know, as you mentioned, we now have, for the first time in history, a single system dominating the globe. And I think it's empirically true. So whether one likes that or doesn't like that, the facts are like that. Mm-hmm. Now, the question that you're asking is like why there is a criticism. And I think that criticism comes essentially from very uneven impact or the effects of globalization, which really affected very strongly, negatively in that sense, compared to the expectations, the middle class of the rich countries. And when you look at, for example, what people say in different parts of the world, like how much they're happy or unhappy with globalization, you definitely find out that the unhappiest parts, of course, France is actually scoring the lowest, and Asian countries are scoring pretty high because they, of course, had particularly China, Vietnam, Indonesia also done pretty well. However, I don't want to sound too optimistic and say that, of course, that it is only a problem that is limited to the Western world. I think it is a broader problem because while capitalism has been extremely successful in raising our standard of living, I think it has two possible problems or blind spots, or maybe things that are inevitable in such a system. Mm-hmm. One is the emphasis on money acquisition and, income and wealth alone, which, has many implications about your value system and so forth. And the second point is really commodification of many activities, including politics. And I think that people, particularly now, young people with the ability to, connect around the world, have become much more cynical about politicians and politics than people were before. And that actually spills out, I think, into discontent and very often into sort of, conflicts or even sort of contempt for the people the elites that rule them.
And I guess nowadays, on that second point, we're seeing a lot of, I suppose you'd call it political polarization on either side of the political spectrum, more so than anything I have in living memory. I mean, I'm only 36, but I don't remember it ever being as polarized as it has been at the moment.
Yes, I think actually parts of the world are pretty polarized. I think the United States is obviously, a case where you have very strong, extremely strong polarization. But I think one has, again, on that to take sort of longer-term picture in mind. Mm-hmm. If you think of the U.S. being very polarized today, which indeed it is, I think, really very polarized, but one has to remember, for example, 1968, the Chicago riots. The polarization that existed then, not only between Democrats and Republicans, but really between the young people and many people who were opposed to the Vietnam War, and which, of course, led even to death, as we know, in the case of Shoot, I think it was Kent. And that has not, luckily, fortunately, has not happened yet, and I think it will not happen. So we should not really, I think, be always under the impression that things were really much better in the past, or things were going swimmingly.
Yeah, well, I think that's also, the what do they call it? The optimism bias, or looking back with rose-colored glasses, rather, and thinking that things have never been worse than what they are at the moment. Essentially, we have a tendency to have a short-term memory and think that things were better in the past for some reason, and get all nostalgic when thinking about, how things were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and so on. Yeah,
Steve, I think actually that's very much true. And for example, I find that in sort of extremely sort of rosy sort of memories, which of course often people have of their own youth, because of course they were younger then, they had maybe ideals and they felt just better. But if you look at the facts, there is no doubt, for example, if I look economically, that of course rates of growth of the rich economies, developed economies in the post-war period, for what the French called les Trente Glorieuses, they were actually higher, much higher, significantly higher than they are now. However, of course, the income levels then were much lower, and also that was the time when we did have like serious conflicts. Again, people forget that France, not only 1968, was really on the edge of almost of a civil war. De Gaulle had to leave France to go and stay with the French troops in Germany in 1968. But even before, during the War of Algerian independence and then the terrorist attacks in France with the OAS and so on. So people tend to forget that these years were not really the years where there was no conflict and everybody was happy and social democracy sort of reigned supreme. And it is true, I said many of these things were true, did actually happen, but one should not forget there were also less pleasant aspects there then as well.
Yeah, and this is something that a lot of economists point to, the post-war boom. And I had Tyler Cowen on the show about 2 years ago, and he was saying how we've never had the same kind of economic growth since then. And I totally get that, and the numbers don't lie, but at the same time, and like you pointed to, we were coming out of World War II, we were essentially in a rebuilding phase, we were coming off a low base, so it's easy to have, well, it's not easy, but it's easier to have that high growth when you're coming off a low base as opposed to the base that we're at today.
Right, absolutely. I totally agree.
So, despite these blind spots that you've alluded to, despite materialism, capitalist excesses and the bringing down of the global economy in 2008, you essentially argue that our job isn't to replace capitalism, but to improve it.
I do argue that, and again, I'm basically, as you know, an empirical economist. I spent, most of my life working with income distribution data, which means really basically with numbers. You get the numbers from household surveys. You look at what numbers tell you. You do have some, obviously, theory, but really you're driven by empirics. So I would actually like to say in that case, in the case of like capitalism, it is also driven essentially by the empirics. You just observe that, of course, capitalism is, as we were saying before, the single mode of production all around the world, and it is the language that we all understand. Whether you go to Nigeria or China or Korea or even North Korea nowadays or US, this is the language of profit and self-interest, and people understand it. So this is really based essentially empirically. And the second empirical fact, I believe, that's of course, the second one is more controversial, but I would say we don't have an alternative that is present to the current organization of capitalist societies. So long as you had communism, or even before communism existed, because in the end of the 19th century, you had very strong socialist movements. There were, of course, strong ideas how the society should be reorganized. So there was an ideological sort of a corpus of views or theories that saw an alternative society. Nowadays, I honestly don't see that. We do have big problems like inequality, like climate change, but neither of them is sort of the solution to neither of these problems is the replacement of capitalism as the mode of production, which means nobody is arguing for state ownership, nobody is arguing for the cooperative movement to end the wage labor, nobody is arguing in favor of planning against decentralized coordination. So these are my, and not only mine, these are actually sort of a standard definition of capitalism, and I think that basically it is still surviving despite the fact that, of course, we do have, as we were saying before, really significant problems.
Yeah. And like you said, we don't really have a strong alternative, but we do have a variant of the liberal meritocratic capitalism, which is political capitalism that is exemplified by China. Now, some claim that it is more efficient, but I know you've pointed to the fact that it has quite a few drawbacks.
Yes, actually, so when we then sort of take essentially capitalism as the way that the economy functions, then we ask the following question: is the political system which goes with that capitalism always the same? And I think we have to say historically that was not the case, because capitalism was able to function whether you have dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, democracies, quasi-democracies. So the political regimes which went with capitalist mode of production were many, or at least several. And I think nowadays we also have at least two. I think these are the two most important ones. The one that I call liberal/meritocratic, which of course the US is the prime example, but it's the system which is, of course, very similar, despite the fact, of course, there are differences between Sweden and Denmark and the US, but it is still organized the same way. In Sweden, you still have, 70% of labor force that is working as wage labor in privately owned companies. So it's not a different system. And politically, both of them are democracies. And then on the other hand, which is the sort of the challenger in the political sphere, not in the economic sphere, I think is China, because that's the system which is, as we know, organized differently, single party. It is a system where the state has quite a lot of influence in the economic sort of life, but also still does have state ownership in part and so on. So it is a capitalist system, but it's a different capitalist system in China or in Vietnam, and I list like a number of other countries that you might disagree or agree, but I think Ethiopia is another case, then Rwanda, Algeria, Burma, and so China is not the only one, but it's obviously the most important one.
Yeah, and the political capitalism, essentially, it's more vulnerable, from what I understand, to corruption and social unrest, essentially, when growth is slow. Yes,
I think so, and obviously this is not my original view. Many people have argued that, of course, China has this GDPism as an ideology, where actually the resilience of the system would be really put to a test when there is a slowdown. And I think that they would be necessarily slowed down for the same reasons that you said before. It was easier, of course, to China. It's not easy, but it's easier for China to go with very high rates of growth of 7, 8, and actually at some time there was even 10% when it was catching up. Now, as China is now becoming it has become middle-income country, and then gradually would even move towards really higher income status, it will become more difficult to actually keep these rates of growth. And the second issue that you mentioned is the issue of corruption. And I argue in the book, I think actually quite strongly, that corruption should be seen really as an inherent, endogenous element to the system of political capitalism, because it's a system that, on one hand, needs an efficient bureaucracy to be run well, and on the other hand, cannot give full rule of law to that bureaucracy, because it always needs discretionary power. So between the gap between these two, efficient bureaucracy and lack of rule of law, is basically corruption, because that's where the corruption is, if you will, lodged in that system.
Yeah, fantastic. So I wanted to change tact a little, Branko, and talk about your previous book, and we'll talk about capitalism alone as well. But in Global Inequality, you essentially found that 80% of one's income can be explained by two factors, being the country of birth, which was attributable to something like 60% of that outcome, right, and the parents' income position, which was 20%. And then the remaining 20% was attributed to things like effort, luck, and other residual factors like gender and race, which I found quite astonishing.
Yeah, well, it is an astonishing number when you think of that. But of course, one needs to sort of realize how is that number derived. Now, when we normally do similar exercises, you say, okay, how much of my income is derived from the fact that I was born to such and such parents, or that are, for instance, with a woman, or, of different race or whatever. We generally do that type of calculations within nation state. And then, of course, we find these numbers, particularly in some countries like Brazil, for example. Obviously, race is a very strong determinant of your income, in this case, negative if you're black, and so on. But when we do it at the level of the world, of course, I didn't have the data neither on gender nor on race. So these two elements are really sort of contained in the 20% that remains to be explained. But what you find is that the country where you are born is really a very significant determinant of your income. So it's really at the global level. And the reason for that, when you think is kind of rather obvious, is that you have enormous differences in incomes between the countries. So essentially, if you're born in a poor country, let's suppose you're born somewhere in Africa, in some poor country, you really cannot go very high on the global income sort of level. I just use that sort of a metaphor in one of my writings. I say, like, suppose that you have like a pole, like a very tall pole, where you have people from the poorest who will be on the bottom to the richest. If you're born in a poor country, you can move a little bit up because there is a little bit of a mobility, or maybe your skill level is good and so on. But you're not going to get anywhere very far to the top, towards the top. On the other hand, even if you're born in a relatively poor family in Germany, let's suppose, or Denmark, or even the United States, which is very unequal society, you are not going to be at the bottom of the world. You're going to be about, I mean, I can tell you the numbers, like about 65th percentile of the world income distribution. So you're going to be in the top tier of the world distribution. And that's why this element of nation of birth becomes so important.
Yeah, and I mean, anecdotally, I can see that in my own experience where, you know, my dad was one of 7 siblings from the Republic of Macedonia, or then Yugoslavia. He was the only one who moved to Australia, and, you know, I still keep in touch with all my relatives over there, and it's not for a lack of ability, but it's just a lack of opportunity that we have had what you would say are vastly different outcomes based on where we essentially grew up.
Absolutely. I mean, it is actually, I often think about myself and other people that I know, and the differences that we experience in income, and some of us are quite lucky, actually, many of us, because we moved, or some of them were born in the richer country, but, you know, the differences in ability are way smaller or non-existent, or maybe in some cases even go the other direction than the differences in income. I'll tell you, for example, an interesting story which happened to me. I remember that maybe 15 years ago, and of course we may have many anecdotes like that, but this one really stuck in my mind. It was in Germany, I think in Dortmund or somewhere, and the guy picked me up at the airport, and he was a taxi driver. He drove me, and we talked during the ride. He was an Afghani, and then he was an Afghani engineer, so who actually left Afghanistan. You know, the war was raging in the country, and then came to Germany. And then finally we stopped. We talked quite a lot of things, and, you know, we stopped in front of the hotel, and he says to me, and turns back and says, "And now tell me, why am I driving you and you're not driving me?" And I thought that was absolutely the valid question. It's just that, you know, one of us was luckier than the other, but there was no, in my opinion, perceptible difference, neither in knowledge nor, I mean, I cannot measure intelligence, but neither in knowledge or ability to speak or anything like that. But our experiences outcomes were quite different. So it could easily be that I should be driving him rather than he driving me.
Yes. And I mean, that's probably a good point to talk about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. And I guess nowadays, depending on which side of the political spectrum you sit, you might be pushing for equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. Now, from where I sit, I think if you have equality of outcome, you're essentially forcing people into positions, you're disincentivizing people who have that ability, and ultimately the decisions that people may suffer, and the organizations that they represent will ultimately suffer, and then the economic flow-on effect isn't going to be positive. I mean, where do you sit on this position in terms of this argument of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome?
You know, I totally agree with that. And I'll tell you what, actually, in the past, before we had the data that we have now, in the past, you could entertain, and very often people entertain this illusion, this idea, that you can really link the two. You can say, okay, fine, we are really very unequal country. There are like big differences in income, but, you know, we are a country with huge opportunities, so everybody, maybe the starting points are different, but everybody will be able to achieve income which is more or less sort of adequate or sort of corresponds to his skill levels or, you know, effort or whatever. But we now have actual data, and the actual data, including by a colleague of mine in New York, Miles Korak, who was one of the first people to put all these numbers together, it very clearly, unambiguously, it shows that the countries with higher inequality of outcomes, meaning higher inequality of income today or wealth today, have also much less favorable outcomes in terms of inequality of, basically intergenerational transmission of inequality from your parents to you. If you're rich, that's good. If you're poor, then basically you stay poor. Mm-hmm. So, the idea that the two of them, inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunities, can be very conveniently delinked, I think that idea is empirically not true. So the countries with high inequality of income generally tend to be the countries where inequality of chances, inequality of opportunity is also quite high, and the transmission of advantages from parents to children, or disadvantages, as the case be, is very strong.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess in terms of inequality alone, isn't a certain amount of inequality just a standard feature of the universe? If you look at Pareto distributions, they occur absolutely everywhere, right? They're observable in the animal kingdom. And to me, it seems like that inequality is inevitable.
No, I totally agree with you, Steve. We are actually talking only the question that we have is inequality that one observes in countries such as such. Is that inequality over the top? Is that inequality reducing inequality of equality of opportunity? Is that inequality making political life being controlled by the rich? Mm-hmm. Is that inequality possibly even reducing economic growth? But, I often get the question that you ask me, and I say to people, because sometimes people think that when we say inequality is too high, we are actually almost being in a binary world where we argue that everybody should be equal. No, obviously not. And I say to them, look, guys, if I'm on the North Pole and the temperature is minus 200 degrees, and I say it's really cold here, it doesn't mean that I really would like to go to the Sahara and have a temperature of plus 50 degrees. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that this minus 200 degrees is not really an optimal temperature. So it's simply you're saying, if you sort of say that inequality is too high, is that you're saying that certain effects that high inequality produces are not desirable, and the lower level of inequality would be better. But it doesn't mean that inequality is zero and we all have the same incomes. That would be, of course, quite... First, it's not achievable, but if it were achievable, for example, some of the socialist countries went pretty far in that direction, it totally destroyed incentives and it actually destroyed growth eventually. So yes. I totally agree with that. We cannot have total inequality. Simply people are different. We are in a different times in our life cycle. You cannot have same income of somebody who is starting their job now and somebody who has been in the job 20 or 30 years. So obviously there are reasons why inequality is good.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And circling back to what you mentioned a few moments ago about different countries and the inequality between countries, you mentioned Africa, for example, but it seems like nowadays the disparity between the economic prosperity between countries is actually getting smaller, but it's more so within those countries where inequality is rising.
Yes, the interesting part in the story in the world nowadays is this twofold story is that on one hand, you have a reduction in global inequality between all citizens of the world. So if you take 7.4, I think, today, billion people, and then you say, okay, how is inequality today compared to inequality like 20 years ago? It is lower today, and it's lower because China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, many of the poor countries in Asia with lots of people have actually grown quite fast, and they have moved, many of them have moved at least, into something which you can call the world middle class. So it is reducing global inequality. And it's also reducing this between-country element, which is an important element both for inequality of global opportunity, but also for migration. But what is also happening at the same time is that income inequality within each of those countries has gone up. In China, it has more than doubled since the reform started. In India, India is now at the level of Latin American countries. India is probably as unequal as Brazil. So within each of the countries, and of course we are not talking about the U.S., which of course inequality went up. So within practically most of the countries, inequality today is higher than it was 20 or 30 years ago. On the other hand, global inequality is less. So that one has to keep these two things in mind. It's sometimes not very easy, but when you kind of break it like that and make people understand that global is now, inequality is less now because of the rise of Asia, I think they essentially figured this out.
And essentially, I mean, that growing inequality within countries is also leading to the rise of, I suppose, Brexit, I mean, the movements in France, populism in the United States. Essentially, I mean,
Right.
You've basically argued that it's resulting in plutocracy in the United States and populism in Europe.
Yes, I think it's actually what is important for the, even methodologically to see that is that we react. Generally speaking, I think maybe in the 99% of cases, we react to inequality within the country that we live in. It's actually, this is our natural comparison. These are peers with whom we compare ourselves. So, and there is, of course, the government of that country that either you elect or at least, participate if you don't elect it directly, but at least you know that you're being governed by somebody. But at the global level, for example, the reduction of global inequality, there is nobody to congratulate about that, nobody to say, well, this is really great, because there is no global government. So what we as individuals perceive is rising inequality, and rightly so, because inequality in the countries that we live in is on the increase, on the rise. So, that's where the political salience of the whole issue of inequality comes from, is that the real inequality that matters to people is inequality within the nation states.
Yeah, and I mean, just on capitalism alone, something you talk about instead is that we need a form of egalitarian capitalism, which essentially comes from a relative equality of endowments. Can you just elaborate on that, Branko?
Yes, actually, I used the term that I intentionally used is the term that was used by Margaret Thatcher. It was the term people's capitalism. And just simply because it is very much a left-wing idea, but of course the term was used by the right-wing politician. The idea behind the people's capitalism is that one of the reasons why inequality is increasing in the rich world is because income from wealth or from capital is very unequally distributed, and the share of total income from capital in GDP or national income is increasing as countries become richer. So if you have really relatively few people and rich people having most of the assets of the country, you basically have a very quick increase in overall inequality. Now, to compensate for that, of course, you have taxation, you have transfers and all that. But there is a certain point where you cannot just simply keep on increasing them because people don't want to pay them and they're really unhappy with high taxation and so on. So what is the solution? What is the alternative? The alternative is having the endowments, which means your ownership of capital and your skill level, or what some people call human capital, being more equally distributed among the population. So that's, of course, more easily said than done. But that means if this is your objective, then the policy should be designed in such a way that you try to reduce this heavy concentration of capital income. Now, you can do it, and I'll just finish on that. You can do it in different ways, and I just list them. I cannot tell what countries should do what, but basically you can give high tax advantages to small investors. You can have like an insurance company that would make sure that they are not going to lose their money. You can also have employee stock ownership plans. You can have plans like the Labour Party now in England, which actually wants to have companies over a given size be obliged to give some shares to workers. So you can have different ways of reducing inequality in endowments. So that's the idea.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess, I mean, one example that may align with what you're talking about there is in Australia about 12 months ago, equity crowdfunding was essentially legislated. So previously, if you wanted to invest in potentially high growth, early stage companies, you would be a venture capitalist, you would be a high net wealth individual. But now that equity crowdfunding has been legislated, you can invest in these companies with as little as $500. So you can gain exposure to these potential high growth opportunities. Is that the kind of thing you're essentially talking about?
Yes. Basically, I think there are many ways, and of course, I don't even know how many ways one can, invent. But the objective should be to have people with modest incomes. I'm not saying poor people, because poor people will never have, even in rich countries, will never have sufficient sort of free, financial capital to invest. But people with modest means, middle class people, lower middle class, upper middle class people, give them the ability to receive a certain amount of income from their investments and to be actually small capitalists, if you will, quote unquote, small capitalists. And it's not only because that sounds good, but I think the rationale for that, the reason for that, is that you then you break that link, which goes for the rising share of capital in total income, which we have seen in all rich countries for the last 30 years, and automatic increase in incomes of the wealthiest people, because other people don't really have capital assets. If you make a much broadly held capital, you would actually have these people benefit as well. The logic of that, let me just put it like that, the logic of that is not different from the logic of broadening the ownership of housing. It's the same logic, is that you want to have people who are of modest means have their own home, which of course provides stability and provides even indirectly some what is called in economics imputed income from the fact that you actually enjoy your own home and you don't have to pay somebody else for the rent.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And it sounds like a much more robust approach than just taxing the rich. And I read an article recently, I think it was a study out of the University of Chicago, Harvard Business School, and Harvard University, where essentially they made a clear distinction, or they made a clear correlation between taxes on income and the adverse impact it has on innovation within that country. So, I mean, you can tax the rich ad infinitum, but at some point it's going to have an adverse impact, and those entrepreneurs that are investing in the local economy are going to take their business elsewhere. And that's obviously an adverse outcome.
That's true. And also you cannot really, I think actually in the rich countries today, there is, I think, much greater reluctance even among the middle class to have their tax rates go up further. It's simply that people feel they're being taxed enough. And precisely if you take this into account, and also the fact if you really tax all the increased tax rates on the very, very rich, you might feel some satisfaction, fine, okay, they will contribute more to the community, but you're not going to generate a huge amounts of money simply from that. So I think that if you sort of think of these two constraints, meaning the middle class that doesn't want to be taxed anymore, and the fact that if you increase tax rates on the very rich, you will reduce innovation, or actually you're not going to generate that much funds, then really your objective should be a more equal endowment, so that the tax rates can be much more sort of, reasonable, and that you don't need to keep on rising them all the time in order to redistribute more money.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I mentioned the Rust Belt in the United States a few moments ago. I guess that's one part of the world that is subject to a lot of automation of what were once blue-collar roles. I mean, there's talk of automated or autonomous trucks taking over the truck driving industry, a lot of factories closing down, and there's talk that 40% or so of today's jobs won't exist in 10 to 15 years, according to the OECD and other outlets. But I know that you dismiss people who claim that robots will take our jobs.
Obviously nobody knows,
Yeah.
But what I'm dismissing it on the following grounds. I'm really dismissing on the historical grounds. I think that this is the fear which has existed from the very beginning of industrialization. We have that after the Industrial Revolution, very famous chapter 31, I believe, in Ricardo, which is titled On Machinery. And of course, the that was the same fear, and actually he discusses whether the introduction of machinery would replace labor and create redundant labor, and we have logistic movements in the UK and so on. So that fear sort of resurfaces regularly every 20, 30 years as we go through different technological revolutions, because they, of course, destroy the jobs, because these jobs are now being done by what is called robots, but really they are machines. In the same way that the cotton gin was a machine, nowadays there is something which looks like which we call robot, but it's also just a machine. And I think that the reason why we feel very strongly about that is, which is understandable, is epistemological reason. We know the jobs that currently exist. We say, okay, 40% of the jobs will be gone. So what are we going to do? But what we are unable to see, and I think it's not because we are stupid, but we just cannot see that, is that we cannot see the new jobs that would be created.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We didn't see, I'm old enough to remember, but 20 years ago, we could never imagine the jobs that have been created from, web designers to people who use, internet to design your garden, to people who use the internet to take your dogs for a walk, for people who are actually delivering food. All of these hundreds, thousands, millions, actually, of new jobs have been created. But nobody, when, had the first PC, who would have guessed these jobs? It was just simply impossible. And this is why the reason why I'm actually skeptical about this fear that all the jobs will be gone is simply for historical reasons, and to some extent really epistemological reasons, because we cannot simply see that. Because if I were able to tell you what would be the jobs in 10 years, well, I would be a very rich man. I would have invested, and I would not build a show. I would be just in Hawaii.
Of course, yeah. And cloud architect, social media manager, data scientist, these are roles that either didn't exist or in much higher demand nowadays than what they were, 20 odd years ago. And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of technology, and every new wave creates a wave of fear. But there's also this economic phenomena called the productivity paradox, where, in the move from steam to electricity, organizations and economies needed to reorganize around electricity, and that took time. And during that period, the economy in some ways may have suffered, but once you made that transition, you actually benefited.
I don't want at all to be actually dismissive of the real and objective and reasonable fears of individual groups of people who indeed, as that was in the case in the past, who were affected and who will be affected by being replaced, what is called actually by several authors in the US, the routine jobs. So they're being replaced now, and they have been replaced, throughout the history. And then it could even move with artificial intelligence. It could move even in what we, until now, have believed were really protected jobs. It could move, it could replace, for example, many of the professors, because you would be able actually to teach, and then one guy could actually teach that, and we see already that now. Harvard has a huge online programs, which I think are larger now than their own Harvard, live teaching at university. But then you can also see that in diagnostics, you can see it in the accounting, you can see that even these jobs would be sort of replaced, redundant, and so on. So it is an objective fear. And if I were in that position, I would be also quite fearful of what would happen. But that does not mean that there will be no new jobs. So these people would either have to be, sort of requalified or reskilled and so on, or many of them may not be ever, if they are at the age that it's very hard to do, they may never be able to get back the jobs that they had or of equal quality. And it's true that on a personal level, it could be difficult situation, sometimes even a disaster. But on a level of a society, I think it's a step forward.
Yeah. Well, it's like I believe the current employment minister of Sweden, Ylva Johansson, says, we will protect the people, but we won't protect the jobs. So it essentially is about preparing ourselves for those new jobs rather than trying to hold on to them for dear life.
Absolutely. And Steve, again, I just don't want to dismiss the legitimate fears of people, because we do see in the U.S., I think very clearly, and it was documented by the work that Angus Deaton and Case did. We see not only that people have lost jobs, some of them, and these jobs really are not coming back, but that was such a traumatic shock that people at a certain age just simply cannot recover from that, and then you have this proliferation of opiate use. You have reduced, which is really quite extraordinary, you have reduced life expectancy of white male at some age. I don't know, I think after 50 their life expectancy is lower now than they used to be, that it used to be 20 years ago.
Yes.
So, these are really things which might again happen with other groups that are affected. But as I said before, there will be always groups that are very, very adversely affected by that. But the overall thing would be an increase in productivity.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for making that distinction. I of course can't speak to an economist on this topic of automation and jobs without raising that three-letter acronym that is so popular today, UBI. What are your views on universal basic income, Branko?
Oh, that's a difficult question. You actually already asked me a difficult one on automation and robotics. Now, that's another one which I perceive myself as being a person on the left, and the left very often now is almost unthinkingly in favor of UBI. And I see certain advantages in the sense that it would give, obviously, a certain guaranteed level to everybody. And then, of course, you would also have more freedom maybe to take a job, not take a job, and do what you like. But on the other hand, I'm a little bit wary of that because I see the UBI also as a way for people who are, billionaires and others who might be controlling the political process and so forth, introducing that at the level which is relatively low, and then essentially saying, you guys, you get paid to do nothing, and so don't actually ask about our incomes, don't ask whether we are actually running the government, just be, happy that you get something. And I believe then an idea of UBI, which is for very different reasons supported by the left and by the right, cannot really satisfy both of these constituencies. In other words, there is, one of them is going to be disappointed. And I think that actually the left might end up by being disappointed by essentially letting the tools or not using the tools of what I was saying before of equalization of endowments, simply in a rather illusory hope that actually the income level that would be guaranteed by UBI would be sufficiently high that you would actually have large transfers and taxation and people would live very comfortably. So I think that it's like a little bit, I'm thinking of this now, saying it aloud, it's like what they call, Greeks bearing gifts, It looks like a gift, but you should be really careful if you really want that gift to receive it.
And I guess as human beings, we're all liable to hedonic adaptation. Like if someone wins the lottery, they feel great for a little while, but then they go back to that sort of baseline and they want more again. And human beings are no different. I mean, if you give someone X amount of dollars for doing nothing, it might be nice for a little while, but then after a while, I mean, we are evolutionary wired to want more, and we're wired to want to contribute, to derive meaning and significance from our work. So the idea of just feeding us fat checks or maybe not so fat checks and that everything will be okay doesn't really align with the human condition.
I totally agree. I think actually a society where you would have 15 or 20% of people who knows, maybe even more, who basically would, as a matter of principle, as lifestyle, would essentially not do anything, would not be an ideal society. I think really we find self-realization, self-accomplishment in work, and I think that we have to encourage people to work, and people do like to work if they're paid well, if they see what they're doing and working, leading to something that they believe. And so that was one further argument, maybe more philosophical argument, why I think that UBI, despite certain advantages that I mentioned before, would be something to really look very carefully if you really want to have that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, speaking of philosophical arguments, I mean, there's something to be said about capitalism and materialism. Essentially, people competing, quite aggressively to acquire more things, more homes, more flashy cars and whatnot. But ultimately, I believe it was Diogenes, the founder of cynicism, who said to Alexander the Great, when Alexander the Great was standing over him and essentially blocking his son, Diogenes asked Alexander the Great to move out of the way, and Alexander's assistant basically said, "Don't you know who this man is? He has conquered the world." And Diogenes responded, "Well, I have conquered the need to conquer the world." And it's just, yeah, it's two totally different schools of thought. Whereas now it seems like with capitalism, everyone is bound by wanting to conquer the world, but oftentimes it comes at the expense of their own sort of, inner peace and just reflecting on who they are and what really makes them happy. Because ultimately, nobody lay on their deathbed saying, "I wish I had accumulated more dollars and more things." It's usually, "I wish I had spent more time with family and friends." And I mean, what's your view on trying to reconcile capitalism with sort of humanity?
Yes, this is something that I actually, in the last chapter of my book, I actually write about that. I'm not a philosopher, but, I've read the literature, so obviously, I cannot claim to the sort of deep philosophical knowledge, but I do think that the economic system and the value system that we have, they need to be mutually consistent. And this is something, since you mentioned Alexander the Great and Diogenes, it goes back actually to Plato, who had 4 types of society, and each of them had one prototype of a person. One which actually was ambitious, another one which was interested in learning, and so on. So capitalism, in order to function the way it is functioning now, to create more wealth and so on, is a system that also requires that individuals participate in those goals. So in other words, that individuals have this spirit of acquisition of wealth, of income, or put money really at the top of their importance, which is not only, it's not bad necessarily per se, because, we know that money is, as we call it, the great equalizer, because it gets rid of all the other certain, historical advantages that were enjoyed by nobility or priesthood or others. Now really it's money alone, which is in that sense good. However, what is, I think, less good is that we lose sight of any other interest. We tend to totally internalize these values ourselves, and because the society essentially tells us, if you're rich, to quote Deng Xiaoping, being rich is glorious, we fully participate in that. And I see that, for example, I mentioned that in the commodification, commercialization, if you will, of our leisure time that we are, of course, now, it's not very, very clear if we're having leisure time on the internet, or we are really using internet to be generating income for ourselves or maybe for the others. Commodification of our, cars, so we can become Uber drivers. Or commodification of our homes, we do Airbnb and so on. So, it has that feature which I think is not ideal, because it really leads us to forget all the other things, including certain other values. It could be religious values or the values, ethical values, which are often sort of forgotten because we all want more money. And this is, I think, one of these 2 blind spots that I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation.
Yes. And as Plato argued, a political or economic system should stand in harmonious relation with society's prevailing values and behaviors, essentially. But I think we kicked off the conversation, Branko, talking about football, so I think we can wrap it up talking about football. I know you've looked at inequality in football or soccer for our American friends, and you looked at the links between labor mobility and inequality in the sport. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, it's honestly an extremely interesting topic, even if one is not really a soccer fan. The interesting part is twofold. First, it is a global a labor market, and there is no labor market which is as globalized as the market for soccer players. Doesn't matter. You may be from Nigeria, you can be from Mali, you can be from wherever you want to be. If you're good, you would actually get a job in the Premiership or in the La Liga in Spain or whatever. So it's really very, very a free market in labor, which is not the case, obviously, as you know, for other occupations to such an extent. Or actually for some of the occupation, not at all like that. So that's really an interesting case. Now, then you say, like, what is the outcome of that? And I think what is interesting, I think the outcome of that was that you essentially had a very high concentration of quality among the richest teams. So that's why we really have in the European Champions League or in the national championships, you basically have always the same teams now for 20 years winning. You know, there are, of course, some Leicester cities, some surprises, but really that happens once in like 10 years or whatever. So we have had a very high inequality in club soccer. And the last thing which is interesting, which is to somehow related to maybe this last point, is that if you see the individuals from small countries playing for big teams, and you see them coming back every 4 years to play for the national team, you can very easily see that as a way of technology transfer. You have a guy from a, I suppose, undeveloped country going and working as an engineer in a fancy company in the US and then bringing that knowledge back to his own country. So that's exactly what happens in soccer, and that's why I think we have at the same time a reduction of inequality between national teams. For example, Croatia is a good example of that. You look at all their players, they of course play all in big, very big foreign clubs, and they're vice champions of the world. Obviously, a very small country after Uruguay, the smallest country to have played in the final of the World Cup. So, we have at the same time high inequality and increasing inequality among clubs and reduced inequality among national teams. So that's the interesting part about soccer.
Yes, hence why Bayern Munich beat Red Star 6-0 the other day.
Absolutely, which would not have happened and actually did not happen, 20 or 30 years ago, because these two teams were much more equal. Of course, in this particular case, Red Star actually beat Bayern, but they were definitely more equal. And if you look, for example, how much was the budget of the two, I have not done that, but maybe the budget of the two was then the ratio maybe 3-1 or 4-1, and nowadays probably the ratio is like 100-1. So that's what really happened, is that you had really very high concentration of quality and power in a very few teams.
Yes. Well, Branko, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for taking the time. If people want to pick up a copy of the book, it's called Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World. They can find you on Twitter at Branko Milan. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up?
No, it was really a pleasure talking to you. It is great. I really enjoyed it very much, even if I have not seen the very end of the Barcelona game. It was still a pleasure.
Well, fortunately today we could find the replay on YouTube very quickly. It's the pleasures of the capitalist world we live in. Thank you so much, Branko.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thanks a lot. Nice talking to you.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Glibeski and on Instagram at TheSteveGlibeski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.